A lot has happened over the 3 years since I last uploaded a video to YouTube, including the publication of my third and fourth books. The books are The Basics, Beyond the Basics, Hexagonal Patterns, and the fourth book, Diamond Patterns. There are well over 100 different patterns in the 4 books, with step-by-step instructions for each one, and detailed diagrams of all the jigs you'll need. The books are available from all Amazon stores, and I'll put links to some of the stores below. The project I'll be going through here is a simple square asa-no-ha with an inner frame called a tsukeko. This piece would then fit into a larger outer frame, and we'll have a look at that in a future video. Before we start, you'll see me flipping the jig around quite often. This diagram shows why I do this, and why you should as well. Marking knives have a bevel, and if that bevel is on the waste side when you mark, you'll get a clean cut. If the flat surface is on the waste side, and the bevel is on the good side when you mark, as is shown in red, the saw will fit into that notch on the good side, and you've automatically introduced a gap into your work. These are the dimensions of the piece I'll be making. The mitsuke of the tsukeko is 8 mm, the jigumi or lattice is 4 mm, and the pattern pieces are 3 mm. The mikomi for all pieces is 12 mm. Before starting, I'd advise you to go through the first cutting exercises video and also the asa-no-ha coaster video. I'll put the links to those below. Right, let's get started. The first step is to make up a story stick marked with the vertical and horizontal dimensions shown in the diagram. We'll start with the vertical pieces, so we need 7 kumiko with a mitsuke of 4 mm. I've cut mine to a length of 900 mm. Take one of the kumiko as the master kumiko and place it next to the story stick. Make sure the ends of the story stick and this master kumiko are butted firmly against the end stop of the kumiko cutting jig. This jig is shown in book 1. For the vertical pieces, we'll be cutting 5 joints and 8 mm tenons on the ends. Transfer the marks from the story stick to the master kumiko. Don't forget to place the pencil marks. These show what side of the mark the joint sits. Flip the master kumiko over and mark the 2 tenons on the ends. Make sure the ends are butted firmly against the end stop. Next, remove the story stick and secure the master kumiko with joints facing up and the 6 other vertical kumiko in the jig. Make sure the ends are firmly against the end stop. transfer all marks from the master Kumiko to the other Kumiko. Set your marking gauge to 4 mm and mark the depth of cut for the tenons. Next, cut all the joint marks down at least 6 mm. This is my normal speed for cutting the joints. Make sure you only cut down to the mark you made for the tenons. Mark the other edge of each of the joints. I explained how to do this in the exercises video and the asa-no-ha coaster video at the links below. After you've made these marks, cut down at least 6 mm. The tenons are 8mm long, so a rough cut in the middle down to the tenon line makes it easier to remove the tenon waste. Once you've done that, remove the waste from the joints and tenons. Finally, place a pencil mark between the tenon and the first joint to indicate that this is the bottom side. Flip the Kumiko over and mark and cut the tenons on the other side. Again, make sure that the ends of all Kumiko are firmly butted up against the end stop. When you've finished removing the tenon waste, remove the Kumiko from the jig and cut off the ends of the tenons. Now repeat exactly the same process with the horizontal Kumiko, although this time you only need to cut 5 Kumiko, but there are 2 extra joints to cut. Here I've decided to round over the tenons, and for this I use a standard bastard file with a safe edge. This is an edge that has a smooth face, so it won't damage the tenon shoulder. The edge on the other side has a normal file face. I've also drilled a few 4mm holes in some MDF to make sure the tenons are the right size. When you're filing, make sure the safe edge is facing towards the tenon shoulder and you file away from the shoulder. When you think you're close, give it a test fit. Don't force it in, otherwise the tenon will snap off. Close, but not quite close enough. This one needs a little bit more work. This is the type of fit you should be aiming at. Next, finish off all the other tenons. Now it's time to put it all together and assemble the Kumiko. Here it's absolutely critical that the horizontal and vertical Kumiko have their correct orientation. Left for the horizontal and bottom for the vertical. These are the pencil marks you place between the tenon and the first joint. For glue, I just use a standard white PVA glue that dries clear. Traditionally, the vertical Kumiko sit on top, so I add a dab of glue to the first joint of all the horizontal Kumiko. I then insert the first of the vertical Kumiko. If the joints feel at all tight, tap the Kumiko in with a hammer and a long piece of wood, rather than with your fingers and thumb. This will help to prevent the Kumiko from snapping at the joint. My joints here were firm, but not too tight, so careful finger pressure was all that was needed. And before moving on, have a quick check the pencil marks are on the left for the horizontal Kumiko and on the bottom for the Kumiko you just inserted. Add glue to the next set of joints. Only a small dab scraped on the top is all that's needed. The vertical Kumiko will take the glue down into the joint as it's inserted. There's no need to smother the joint in glue. It's always wise to have a quick check for correct orientation before you start inserting. Continue adding glue and inserting the Kumiko until they're all in. And make sure you check each one for correct orientation. In all of the workshops I've run, jumbled Kumiko orientation is the main cause of problems that the students have with gaps and difficulty in joining the Kumiko together. If orientation is correct, there are rarely any problems with assembling the Kumiko and attaching the tsukeko, which is the next step in this project. The wood I use here is an Australian timber called hoop pine. It's a very easy timber to work with, and to me is highly suited to Kumiko work. In other parts of the world you'll have to experiment with the timber you have available, but any clean, straight-grained softwood should work. In the early stages, it would be best to avoid using any hardwood timber that's dense and difficult to cut. One question I'm often asked is how I dimension the timber for Kumiko work. I explained how I do this in an Instagram post I made in April 2016, and I'll put a link to that below. My Instagram page has a lot of photos of patterns that I've made and a few videos as well, so it might be of some interest. And I'll put a link to that as well. That's the jigumi done, and there's no way this is going to come apart. It's also the end of part 1. In part 2, I'll make up and attach the tsukeko, then it's on to the fun part, the asa-no-ha pattern.